I'm going to talk to you about one of the really important topics in my life, which is how do we innovate in cities, and what are the big trends that are basically affecting the way that we're thinking about our cities, the way we want to use them, and the way we want to design them. And one really big thing that's happened in the past kind of 15, 20 years is the advent of data. And what data is invisible. So we can't see actually at this point in time all the data that we're generating, and I'm sure lots of you are tweeting, lots of you are on the phone, lots of you are actually connected to cell phone networks, lots of you are connected to 3G, or actually the Wi-Fi here. So we're actually, in this room alone, we're actually connected to a bunch of networks that we cannot see. These networks are pervasive. There are black spots in the world, but in the kind of context that we're talking about in the OECD countries, it's pretty much pervasive. And it's also growing. There is more and more data being created any second now than there has been ever before. And this is a little bit of an infographic to look at. Even just the activity on social media is humongous. Like, I'm just, there's 27,000 Tumblr blog posts being posted every 1 minute. Or, Facebook user shares, there's 684,000. And so this is just the activity that we actually, that our social activity leaves, the traces that our social activity leaves on the internet and so on. But actually, cities, the infrastructure that we live in is actually generating data all the time. So my kind of hypothesis, if you will, is I really want to get to this point where we, in the decision makers and the designers of cities, where we start thinking about, does data change the way that we consider our cities? Does data, the flows of information, actually have an impact on that? And I actually believe it does. But I'll take you through that argument. We'll start from a very obscure place. We'll start with cholera, actually. I'm sure none of you were expecting that, and that's great, because there's a surprise effect for that. And the reason I start with cholera is because cholera is bacteria. Cholera, obviously you can see it through a microscope, because this is a photo of the cholera bacteria itself. But cholera actually was invisible for the longest time. And the reason I bring that up is because being able to visualize not only the bacteria, but where it sat spatially in a city has actually led to a whole number of transformations of the way we build our cities and the way we consider public health systems, for example. And I want to start with the work of somebody who I think is actually pretty amazing, and this is Charles Booth. Charles Booth was active in the late 19th century, and he was what we call a philanthropist. And that was in Victorian England, the really nice word for a guy who actually cares about what is happening to poor people. And although at the time, I think a lot of the ways that we kind of constructed why people were poor and why they were sick it was quite outdated. But nevertheless, what Charles did was really quite fantastic in the sense that he had this hunch that poverty, illness, and your environment were linked. Right? And so what he's doing here, this is a map of the East End of London, he's doing this anthropological research where he's not just kind of devising social theories and saying like, oh, well, the poor are sick because, that's just the way they are kind of thing. But he's actually trying to look at the environmental conditions that make that happen. And so he's mapped out the relationship between income and the incidence of cholera in these places in East London. And what he found is through doing that in a systematic, statistical way, he was able to find that cholera actually was occurring in certain water sources that people were using. And at the time, the prevalent theory was that the people got sick because they caught these miasmas, and nobody knew what a miasma was, but it kind of like hopped from one person to the other. But actually being able to visualize what the source of the problem was, that the water was the source of the problem, actually shaped the way that we now consider public health, the way we now separate out our human waste from our drinking water, and so on and so forth. So visualizing and being able to see the invisible can have transformative impact. And so data is no different in a way. Now, data is generated by networks of sensors. We've got networks of sensors in this room. We've probably got a Wi-Fi router, or maybe not. We've got actually phones that are sensors as well. But one of the really earliest kind of modern networks of sensors is CCTV. Now we have, I think there's one country that's very famous for having a really extensive CCTV network, and that is England, and London in particular. But England has 500,000 CCTV cameras. London has some precincts, London has some, London has some neighborhoods that have up to 4 cameras per every 1,000 inhabitants. And we all know the benefits of CCTV. We all know that it enables, to reconstruct some stories and understand events better. But we also know that, any regular Londoner going from their house to the subway station or to work will be photographed something like 6 times, and that's pretty scary. Situation. And obviously some people comment on this and think, one nation under CCTV, and that's pretty much how it feels sometimes. And it actually feels like a bit of a real life occurrence of what George Orwell actually predicted in 1984. But the ability to sense the way that our city is performing, the agency of people that have in it, is actually also a really positive thing. I think we could choose to see it in this light, but we could also choose to see it as an opportunity. That's what I'm going to argue today. Because data about the city and the systems that govern our cities is actually the connective tissue. It's actually the one part that is actually common to everything that we do in the city. So this diagram shows us really that energy systems generate data, water systems, food, logistics, mobility, every single thing about urban activity generates data. And this real-time or internet-based data actually has a transformative impact on every aspect of urban governance. And so therefore, having better data, having more data in the future and now is starting to change not only the way that we organize our public service and private service for that matter, but it's also impacting the way we think about designing our cities. So the first step towards really understanding what data does is visualizing it. And so I'm going to show you a few examples of things that of data visualization, some early ones and some late ones. And I think the real paradigm shift, and the reason I chose this one, this is the 1861 US Census. And it's a very early infographic, if you will. And the reason why this is a different map than any contemporary map in the 1860s is because it's showing a population aspect. So it's showing something that is not a geographical feature or a geological feature or any kind of fixed feature. It's actually showing the agency and the characteristic of people as they inhabit space. Now, it's very simple. It's based on census data, which at that time would have been very difficult to collate. And this is actually showing the distribution of slave population in 1861. And that's why, we'll build on this. And this idea of actually placing the experience of people, or the agency and what people do in the city, is what was behind the Situationists when they were thinking about, way out in the future. They loved thinking about way out in the future. Forget how the city is as an object. It's all going to be about the way that we experience its various bits and stick that together. So I have it produced some of these really cool visualizations of what that would look like. Now, we're doing this all the time now. There's people who, in a kind of recreational or hobby capacity, or even in a professional capacity, have become data journalists. And one of those guys is Eric Fisher. Eric Fisher started really early on using geolocated Flickr images to understand what's being photographed in the city. And how cool is that? So he's produced these maps where the red zones, and I think this is it London or Paris? I don't know, anyway. I should have checked that one. But he's done this over all kinds of cities in the world, and he's looking at the really densely photographed places in the city and visualizing that through a mapping software. And now he's been able to refine that. That's some of his early work. And his later work is actually looking at that at a global scale. So what are the tweets and the photographs that are being generated? He's put this in a map together. And if you realize, there's two things that comes out of that is the sheer volume of stuff that we can put on the internet really through social media. But it also shows you an incredible economic divide between the countries that are really incredibly connected. And it also shows you that it's an infrastructure thing. So you need to have the backbone, you need to have the broadband, you need to have all those aspects to be able to participate in this information economy. Another example of visualizing this, a similar concept, is using Getty images. to Getty being the photography, they sell images and stock photos and so on, but they also take photos of events and different cultural events, and they geotag them and tag them. In using that database, there's been a whole series of maps of New York City trying to map the geography of the buzz of different industries from TV, fashion, media, and so on. So this is an example from the Spatial Information Design Lab at Columbia. Another example, and this is quite an early one as well, which is using mobile phone towers and your phone in your pocket and your activity on the cell phone network to be able to visualize where the spikes of mobile phone usage is during this particular event. And this is during the Madonna concert in Rome a few years ago. And this really shows which space actually around the arena was actually really spiking up in terms of mobile phone usage. And we can do that now. I could show you this as a movie, but we can do that now in animated form, and we can look at actually people's traces and how they travel through the city, looking only at what digital trace they've left on the cell phone network. So it's actually quite complicated, and we're actually being able to leverage these extensive sensor networks to be able to visualize how people use the city. This I thought was really interesting because MySpace has revamped. Who thought MySpace would actually put any work into that? And the thing that they've done is that they've helped Justin Timberlake understand where his fan base is, so, which I think Justin would really appreciate. And so it turns out that, what did it say? 86% of Justin's fans on MySpace are women, and that also 67 are women, 86 of them are in the United States. And so for being able to visualize this for Justin would be really helpful in actually maybe targeting some blokes and also maybe organizing some international tours. So social media is really building in these kind of geo-reference visualization tools to enable to understand where the data comes from. So I think that, yes, digital information and data is going to change the way we design our cities. And I say this, the impacts will be in 6 different areas. Number 1, it's going to shift urban design into service design. And this is some of the work that we've done at Arup working with the city of Melbourne. They came to us about 3 years ago and said, really like this data thing, but what does it mean for us? And so we organized a really fantastic workshop environment where we developed some concept appetizers to tell the city of Melbourne, in terms of your government services as a local council, what are the things that you can do with data? And it's partly the design of your cities, but it's mainly the design of the services in your city. So one of the services we came up with was this real-time dashboard of what the city is doing, how it's performing on different economic and environmental indicators. So anything from the weather to where pedestrians are walking, or all the way through to I had other aspects here, where the mobile phone is being used, what the GHG emissions are. So it's actually a complete look at the performative aspects of a city. So that's one of the services. Another is actually, I've got to go through this really quickly. So here's a few concept appetizers around this, where it's about showing the data in the city itself. This one is another one. I'll just have to go really quickly. And what's really important about this is the understanding that data actually opens up the opportunity for others to participate in the creation of services. Okay, I'll have to move quickly. Mass insight. You can understand really well with data how people are using the city on a statistically significant scale. So for example, one of the things we were looking at is visualizing how people complain about noise in Melbourne. And so we're looking at what are the incidences, where are they occurring, and what are the causes. And it actually helps you, rather than looking at a spreadsheet, it actually helps you visualize that and actually compare year on year how people are complaining about noise. This is a really good example from Nicholas Felton, which is a guy who actually tracks everything about his life. And when he compiles this report, which is called the Feltron report, he can see the trends in his life actually, and get mass insight into what he's doing, what music he listens to, how he uses a city. Digital public space. We're actually talking about connected public space, which means that the behavior we have in those public spaces is going to change. Like this is somebody actually working outside the State Library of Queensland, but within the perimeter of the glow of its Wi-Fi networks. It also gives the opportunity for interactive public art. These are little lights that we created for the Vivid Festival that are interactive to other lights and to the light that you shine onto them. Carbon injustice, and this is a bit of a belabored point, but I'm not going to have much time to make about it, but the fact is that data, every time you put that status update on your Facebook, it's not just absent, and it just, it does exist physically, and it's being saved in data centers somewhere. There's a whole geography of data centers, the energy intensity that they command, actually, and what you're able to the environmental consequence they have, and then what kind of developments are possible around them. That's really actually coming out at the moment, as data centers actually create 2% of the world's energy consumption at the moment. So it's pretty huge. Hyper-performing infrastructure, in the conversation, I'll skip this one, but in the conversation about the broadband and NBN and so on, actually, the fact that we're building for 20 megabytes per second at the moment is already overridden. The fact that we've got SaberNet, for example, that's 1 gigabyte per second, and all those educational broadbands are much quicker, means that actually, if you have that expectation of infrastructure and the transfer of data, place actually becomes relevant because you get that much more time, that the small milliseconds it takes to, for example, make a high-frequency dealing trade, the distance between you and the central server will make all that difference. And so there's a whole other geography around the expectation of the performance of the infrastructure and how quickly you need it to get there. And this is one of the things also, this high-performing infrastructure means that the infrastructure can give you information about how it's being used. This is a map about the visualization of the Vélib docking stations in Paris. And they tell you in real time which ones are available, which ones aren't, which actually plans the whole operation of the Vélib service, because they have to truck those bikes all around the city to make sure that they're being parked in the right places. And the most important for me, it means that data means, and the digital traces mean that we can actually shift design from a predictive discipline to an adaptive tool. And it means that through behavioral data, we can actually learn from the way that our cities are being used, what people like and don't like about them, and actually design them better in an iterative process. Thank you very much.